The annual Flaxborough flower show, held under the polite canopy of the town hall marquee, had begun with all the decorum expected of a market town at the height of summer. Rows of dahlias, marigolds and roses glimmered beneath the gentle sweep of afternoon sunlight. There was the customary murmur of civic pride, punctuated by the faintly competitive rustle of women's skirts and the polite coughs of gentlemen who knew far more about horticulture than they would admit. Inspector Purbright, seated at the very edge of the crowd, observed quietly, a notebook resting unassumingly in his lap. He had attended these shows for several years, always for reasons of curiosity, rather than any fondness for marigolds. He preferred to watch. People, he had long learned, revealed far more about themselves than any blossom ever could. The mayor, a rotund man with a shiny, bald crown, moved from table to table, offering brisk congratulations. Lady Mallory, the chief adjudicator, peered at a particularly robust gladiolus, her lips pursed in disapproval as if she had just sniffed a minor insult. Behind them, Mrs. Pettigrew whispered to Miss Lacey, her voice an octave higher than necessary, ensuring that everyone in proximity caught the latest news about Mrs. Lacey's daughter's alleged engagement. It was, by all outward appearances, the epitome of untroubled civility, until a small, sharp shriek pierced the polite murmurs. Heads turned to the far end of the marquee, where Sister Agnes, the town's quietly formidable nun, had collapsed beside the table of begonias. She clutched her chest as if seized by sudden pain, and yet her lips moved, forming words that no one could quite hear. For a moment, confusion reigned. Mrs. Pettigrew fainted lightly into Miss Lacey's arms. Someone, somewhere, suggested calling a doctor. The mayor gesticulated in alarm. Purbright rose not with any rush or dramatics, but with the calm precision of a man who knew both when to act and when to observe. By the time a doctor arrived, it was clear that Sister Agnes was breathing, though her complexion retained a shade of worry. "What happened?" asked Lady Mallory, her voice pitched in that genteel way, which masked both concern and the subtle fear that such a scandal might upset the judging panel. Sister Agnes's reply was whispered, almost conspiratorial. I heard something. A confession." Her eyes darted nervously about the marquee, as if the begonias themselves might eavesdrop. The words, though softly spoken, rippled outward like a stone thrown into the still waters of the town. A confession? In Flaxborough? The notion, so utterly improbable, could not help but stir speculation. Purbright, for his part, said nothing. He noted only the slight tremor in Sister Agnes's hands, the faint smudge of dirt on her habit, the way she avoided the gaze of several prominent townspeople who had crowded nearby. A confession, he thought, is a curious thing. It might be true, it might be false, or it might reveal more about the listener than the speaker. The mayor cleared his throat. "Shall we, resume the judging?" The assembled crowd, compelled by propriety, did so, though the subtle tension lingered. Whispers threaded through the marquee like the faintest draught. What confession? Who had made it? And why had Sister Agnes, our serene and incorruptible Sister Agnes, reacted so dramatically? Purbright, meanwhile, made a mental note of the reactions rather than the flowers. The anxious twitch of Mr. Tilley, chairman of the Horticultural Committee, the suspicious frown of Mrs. Larkins, whose roses had just been judged second best, the slight smirk of the vicar, who always enjoyed a minor moral scandal from the safety of his collar. Each movement, each carefully measured glance, would later speak louder than any shouted accusation. By the time the prizes were announced, blue ribbons, red ribbons, and the occasional murmured protest, the incident had not yet been resolved. The town, ever eager to gossip, had already begun layering embellishments upon the facts. Sister Agnes had fainted at the sight of a poisoned dahlia. Someone had confessed to a theft, perhaps a crime more sinister, yet lingered unseen. Purbright made a note to himself. Observe first, comment later. The flowers would fade, the ribbons would be pinned, and the scandal, subtle though it was, would grow in ways no one could yet predict. And somewhere quietly, a confession waited to be understood. The town, as it often did, took over the shaping of events in ways that no one, not even the mayor, could fully control. By the next morning, the flower show incident had grown in the telling, morphing from a simple fainting fit into a murmur of mystery that slithered through the cobbled streets of Flaxborough. At the baker's, Mrs. Tuppence spoke of a whispered confession she claimed to have overheard in the marquee, though no one could recall precisely what it entailed. At the railway buffet, men in bowler hats speculated on who might have confessed to what, each version more elaborate than the last. Even the postman, an otherwise silent observer of human eccentricity, had taken to pausing longer at doors, nodding knowingly, as if aware of some scandal hidden behind every lace-curtained window. Purbright arrived at the convent in the late morning, just after the bells had tolled 11. Sister Agnes, still pale but more composed, met him at the door. Her habit was slightly rumpled, as though she had slept in it, and her eyes retained that peculiar tension between fear and obligation. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head in the smallest bow, "I am afraid I cannot recall clearly what was said. Only that it was urgent." He listened patiently, noting the precise hesitations, the subtle shifts of weight. "You heard a confession then," he said, his voice neutral, "but you do not remember its content." Sister Agnes nodded. "Yes. Or perhaps it was a fragment, a detail too fleeting for me to grasp fully." Purbright made no further remark. Instead, he spent the morning quietly observing the convent grounds, speaking to the gardeners and the novice nuns. Each offered polite statements, some redundant, some contradictory, all revealing small inconsistencies in tone or timing. Miss Winslow, the novice who had been nearest to Sister Agnes at the marquee, mentioned seeing a tall figure in the shadows near the flower tables, though she could not be certain it was anyone in particular. Brother Hamish, the gardener, admitted to moving a box of potted marigolds earlier in the afternoon, though he seemed flustered by Purbright's simple, pointed questions. By afternoon, Purbright had already begun to map the subtle dynamics of the town, the quiet rivalries, the long-standing resentments, the petty envies that everyone wore with the utmost propriety. Mrs. Larkins, who had lost the top rose prize, displayed a faint but discernible stiffening whenever the nun was mentioned. Mr. Tilley, ever punctilious in his own judgments, avoided direct eye contact when Purbright inquired about who might have been close to Sister Agnes during the incident. The vicar, whose mild expression rarely betrayed much, seemed to enjoy the speculation more than was entirely decorous. Back at the town hall, the mayor fretted over the growing chatter. "It must be addressed," he insisted, wringing his hands. "A proper explanation, calm and dignified, is essential. Flaxborough cannot survive on whispers alone." Purbright, however, preferred silence. He let the town chatter, he let the rumours gather like leaves in a quiet stream. Each fragment, each slip of memory, each shaded glance added to the mosaic of human behaviour he was constructing, and slowly, with the patience that only years of observing Flaxborough life could impart, patterns emerged. By evening, a subtle but unmistakable clue had taken shape, a tiny, overlooked envelope tucked behind one of the prize certificates in the flower show marquee. It bore the faintest smudge of lipstick, and inside a hastily scribbled note that read only, "Meet me where the lilies bend at dusk. You will regret silence." Purbright held the note delicately, noting the careful, almost formal handwriting. The message was neither loud nor dramatic, yet it carried the weight of intention, of something secreted away from the town's polite veneer. It was, in his experience, precisely the sort of signal that pointed not toward random mischief, but toward deliberate concealment, human motives masked beneath civility. And as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Flaxborough, Purbright considered the next step with quiet resolve. He would need to observe, to wait, and, when necessary, to confront with the gentlest firmness until the truth revealed itself. The town, in the meantime, settled into its usual evening rhythm. Doors were bolted, shutters lowered, and gossip softened into low hums and half-finished conversations. Yet, Beneath the ordinary patina of Flaxborough life, something lingered, something minor, almost invisible, that would, when the time came, illuminate the path to the truth. Purbright began his inquiries the following morning, choosing to start where observation promised the greatest yield, among those closest to the incident. He visited the marquee once more, noting the slightly rumpled tablecloths and the faint, lingering scent of roses. Miss Winslow, nervous but eager to please, recounted again her impressions of the fainting, adding now that she thought she had seen Mrs. Larkins slip away from the judging table shortly before Sister Agnes collapsed. "Alone?" Purbright asked softly, tilting his head. "Alone, I think," she replied, though her hesitation suggested she was less certain than she wished to appear. "Though Mr. Tilly was nearby, I suppose?" Purbright made a note, but asked no further questions, allowing the pause to speak for itself. Each fragment of recollection, however trivial, carried the potential to contradict or confirm others, and he had learned long ago that the truth was rarely announced loudly. It arrived quietly, between silences and glances. He next called upon Mrs. Larkins at her rose-scented sitting-room. She was polite, if a trifle sharp, her hands busy, straightening photographs on the mantel. "Inspector," she said, "I assure you, I had no involvement whatsoever. I was merely displeased with the judging. My roses were exemplary. And yet," Purbright replied with gentle neutrality, "you left the marquee shortly before Sister Agnes fainted?" Mrs. Larkins stiffened, pursed her lips, then offered a dismissive wave. "I took a moment's air. One cannot remain in a crowd endlessly. You understand, Inspector, I do not follow every feint or flutter." He observed her closely, noting the subtle twitch in her fingers and the brief, involuntary glance toward the window, as though measuring whether her denial had been properly received. Such details were the language of human behavior, quiet, revealing, and insistently persistent. Later that morning, Purbright met with Mr. Tilly at the Horticultural Committee rooms. Mr. Tilly was a man who thrived on precision, and yet there was a faint sheen of anxiety on his brow. He spoke meticulously of schedules, prize distributions, and the strict order of judging, all the while offering small contradictions. A passing remark that he had not noticed anyone approaching Sister Agnes, followed by admission that he had, in fact, seen a figure hovering near the begonia display. The picture began to take shape, though it was incomplete. Each statement, each hesitation, each carefully chosen word added threads to a subtle tapestry. Mrs. Larkins' irritation, Tilly's attentiveness, Sister Agnes's reaction, and the mysterious note found behind the prize certificate. It was a web of ordinary people behaving in extraordinary ways, their motives mundane, yet entangled in secrecy. By afternoon, Purbright returned to the convent with the note still folded neatly in his pocket. Sister Agnes seemed calmer, though a faint tension lingered about her jaw. He asked again about the confession. "Perhaps," she suggested slowly, "it was not so much a confession as a warning, or a request." Her voice wavered. "I cannot be certain." Purbright merely nodded. Certainty, he knew, was a luxury seldom afforded in Flaxborough. What mattered was pattern, and here the pattern hinted at deliberate concealment, a careful orchestration designed to unsettle rather than inform. He spent the evening walking the quiet streets, letting the cool dusk air carry the murmurs of the town to him. Windows glowed warmly, curtains twitched as neighbours exchanged cautious greetings, and the faint hum of gossip persisted like an undercurrent beneath the otherwise placid surface of civic life. Somewhere, within the everyday proprieties and polite deceptions, the individual who had left the note waited, believing themselves unseen. Purbright allowed the thought to settle. There would be time for confrontation, but only when the moment was exact. For now he would continue to watch, to gather, to map each subtle gesture, each minor lie, each quiet observation, knowing that in Flaxborough the smallest detail often bore the heaviest weight. And as the stars emerged one by one above the rooftops, he felt, with patient certainty, that the next move would come, not with force, but with the gentle inevitability of a confession that had waited to be heard. The next day, the first tentative conclusions began to emerge, though Purbright withheld judgment as usual. The town had already seized upon a convenient suspect, Mr. Tilley, the meticulous chairman of the Horticultural Committee. His presence near Sister Agnes at the time of her fainting, coupled with his occasional slips in recounting events, had fueled a whispering chorus that suggested deliberate interference. At the bakery and along the high street, people spoke in measured tones that carried the unmistakable hint of accusation. "Did you hear about Tilley? I wonder what he was doing near the nun. One ought to keep an eye on such exacting men." Purbright, however, was unimpressed by convenience. He understood the town's need for a neat resolution, one that wrapped unease into the tidy package of blame, but he preferred to let events unfold under his quiet observation. He visited Mr. Tilley once more, choosing to appear casual rather than confrontational. The man greeted him with a smile that was polite but tight, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "Inspector," he said, "I assure you, my only interest was the proper arrangement of the tables. I cannot account for Sister Agnes fainting beyond her own nervousness, which is considerable." Purbright made no reply, merely lifting an eyebrow and pausing, allowing the silence to fill the room. Mr. Tilley shifted slightly, glanced at a nearby ribbon display, then cleared his throat. "If it reassures you, I left the marquee for a few minutes to inspect the perennials. I believe I returned before the incident occurred." A casual observer might have accepted this explanation. Purbright, noting the slight hesitation and the unnatural precision of the statement, made a mental note to corroborate the timing. A man of Mr. Tilley's temperament might well have been meticulous, yet even the meticulous could stumble when observed carefully. Later that afternoon, Purbright returned to the convent to speak with Sister Agnes. She appeared serene, though a subtle tremor in her hands betrayed lingering unease. "Inspector," she said, almost apologetically, "I fear I have little to add." The confession, or warning, was brief. "I remember only a sense of urgency and the faintest whisper of a name, though I cannot place it." He nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, sister, you reacted strongly. Perhaps it was not the words alone, but the tone, the insistence?" She considered this, then inclined her head. "Yes, that and the way it was spoken. There was determination behind it." Purbright filed the observation carefully. Tone, insistence, determination, these were the human clues that often revealed more than spoken words. As he left, he noticed a minor detail previously overlooked: the small scuff mark on the floor of the marquee near the begonia table. It was faint, but distinct, and suggested that someone had brushed past in a hurry, almost imperceptibly. The angle of the scuff did not align with Mr. Tilley's reported movements, nor with Sister Agnes's collapse. It was a trivial mark in itself, but it whispered a story that no one else had noticed. The inspector spent the evening mapping the web of timings, locations, and movements, each minute observation layered atop the next. By nightfall, a pattern was emerging. The first suspect, tidy and seemingly plausible, no longer fit perfectly with the facts. Somewhere in the town, someone had orchestrated a small but deliberate disturbance, enough to unsettle, enough to mask intention, yet carefully executed to avoid obvious scrutiny. Purbright, for his part, prepared to wait. The next phase of inquiry would require subtlety, patience, and the gentle probing of those whose civility hid more than it revealed. In Flaxborough, he knew, the truth rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived in whispers, gestures, and the smallest deviations from routine. And as he watched the street lamps flicker on along the high street, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood that the game had only just begun. Purbright spent the following morning in the quieter corners of Flaxborough, where the minor grievances and subtle tensions of the townspeople could be observed with less interference. He began with Mrs. Pettigrew, who, despite her previous fainting fit at the marquee, was eager to share her impressions of the flower show. "You see, Inspector," she said, fingering the lace at her wrist, "it was all very distressing. That poor Sister Agnes. And yet one could not help but notice how some people seemed intrigued rather than concerned." "Intrigued, or perhaps relieved," Purbright offered gently. "Relieved that attention was elsewhere." Mrs. Pettigrew nodded, eyes widening slightly as if the distinction had never occurred to her. "Ah, yes, of course." He walked on to the vicar, who received him with the usual mild amusement, a hint of curiosity lurking behind polite restraint. "A confession, you say? One might think our dear Sister Agnes prone to dramatic flair, yet the note you found seems rather deliberate." "Do you suspect mischief, Inspector?" Purbright did not reply, merely observing the slight rise of the vicar's eyebrows and the subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other. Civility, he noted, rarely masked total innocence. By mid-afternoon, he had called upon a few more townspeople, each revealing, intentionally or not, minor contradictions in timing, phrasing, or tone. Mrs. Larkins, still smarting from her second-place rose, confessed to a brief altercation with a fellow gardener over a misplaced prize ribbon, though she insisted it was trivial. Mr. Tilley, anxious to maintain his reputation for exactness, fidgeted with a clipboard and repeated his account of the marquis with increasing rigidity. Then there was Miss Lacey, who seemed to enjoy the town's fascination with scandal far more than she admitted. She mentioned, almost casually, that she had overheard the faintest of arguments the previous week, between two nuns and someone unknown, about a matter best kept quiet. Her eyes twinkled as she spoke, and Purbright, noting the carefully measured delivery, added her comment to the growing tapestry of potential leads. It was during a quiet walk past the now empty flower show marquee that Purbright noticed the subtle detail that had previously escaped attention: a single, overturned chair tucked beneath a table far from where any judging or ribbon disputes had occurred. The legs bore the faintest marks of scuffing, angled in a way that suggested hasty movement, perhaps a retreat, perhaps a confrontation. It was trivial, almost laughable, yet to Purbright's trained eye it suggested someone had moved with purpose, unseen and deliberate. Evening fell, and with it a gentle hush over the streets of Flaxborough. The notes of gossip had not entirely faded, but they had been replaced by the ordinary rhythms of commerce, supper, and polite evening strolls. Purbright returned to his office, quietly cataloguing observations, timings, and inconsistencies. By now, a pattern was emerging that contradicted the neat suspicion directed at Mr. Tilley. The web of small-town rivalries, private grievances, and minor secrets suggested a more nuanced orchestration, one that involved careful timing, a subtle misdirection, and an awareness of human behavior that only someone intimately familiar with the town could possess. Purbright leaned back in his chair, letting the gentle quiet of the evening settle around him. The trivial, overlooked details, the note, the scuffed floor, the chair, the fleeting glance, the subtle hesitation, were beginning to converge. Somewhere, amid the ordinary lives and seemingly inconsequential routines, a deliberate plan had been enacted. And he understood, with the calm patience that defined him, that the next move would reveal itself in due course, requiring only the gentle nudge of observation and the precise timing of a question. The next morning brought with it an event that quietly unsettled the rhythm of Flaxborough. The town's postman discovered a small package at the convent's back gate, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. Inside there was no note, no flourish, only a single, slightly smudged confession form, the kind used in ecclesiastical matters, folded and creased as though hastily handled. Sister Agnes, upon seeing it, paled once more, a tremor passing through her hands, though she remained outwardly composed. Word travelled swiftly, as it always did, and the town murmured with careful, polite speculation. The mayor, consulted as a matter of civic duty, fretted about appearances, while the vicar murmured something about divine providence and the weight of secrets left unspoken. Even Mrs. Pettigrew and Miss Lacey, whose previous gossip had been lively but innocuous, felt the stirrings of unease. Purbright arrived at the convent shortly after the discovery. He examined the package carefully, noting the type of paper, the faint fingerprints and the precise folds. No message was included, no signature, only the carefully completed confession form itself. "Inspector," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice tinged with the residual tremor, "I do not understand. It seems deliberate. Someone wishes me to know, but not to know entirely." "Indeed," Purbright said softly, observing the slight curl of her lips, the measured tension of her posture, "and it appears designed to unsettle rather than inform. Quite subtle, quite precise. He spent the morning retracing movements from the flower show, speaking again to Miss Winslow, Mr. Tilley, and a few other townspeople who had been nearby. Each offered careful, polite statements, but with small variations that betrayed human fallibility. A glance too long, a hesitation too brief, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. It was in these minor inconsistencies that Purbright discerned the outline of intent. Someone had orchestrated the first fainting, the whispered confession, the note behind the prize certificate, and now this second, more tangible incident. Each move was small, restrained, almost imperceptible, but together they suggested careful planning. By mid-afternoon, he returned once more to the marquee, now deserted and echoing faintly with memories of last week's flower show. The overturned chair still lay tucked beneath the table. The faint scuff marks remained on the floor. He bent to examine them, noting angles and wear patterns, the subtle signs of hurried movement. The trivial details whispered a story of someone acutely aware of timing, distance, and human behavior, someone accustomed to observation. Purbright left the marquee and walked slowly along the high street, watching windows and doorways, allowing the town's rhythms to unfold around him. He understood that the first suspect, Mr. Tilley, no longer fit the emerging pattern. The careful orchestration, the measured provocations, and the subtle psychological nudges indicated a mind that thrived on control, yet remained concealed beneath civility. Evening fell, quiet and unremarkable, yet within the ordinary streets and lamplit shopfronts, Purbright sensed the presence of deliberate intention. The next steps would require patience, subtle testing, and observation of human behavior at its most ordinary and revealing. Somewhere, in the polite facades of Flaxborough life, the orchestrator waited, assuming themselves unnoticed. But Purbright, with his customary stillness and attention to detail, had already begun to chart the path that would lead to truth, one small gesture at a time. That evening, as the lamps along Flaxborough's high street cast long, softened shadows, Purbright sat quietly in his study, surveying the threads of the unfolding mystery. He preferred reflection over action at this stage, allowing the patterns of human behavior to reveal themselves in due course. The town's outward calm, punctuated by polite conversation and measured social duties, concealed undercurrents that were subtle, persistent, and revealing. He considered Sister Agnes's fainting, the whispered confession, the note behind the prize certificate, and the subsequent anonymous delivery of the confession form. Each had been minor, almost negligible in isolation, yet collectively they suggested deliberate orchestration. The effort was not dramatic, not overt. It was precise, almost surgical, designed to unsettle without drawing attention to itself. Such careful manipulation required both insight and familiarity with the town's social rhythms. Purbright thought of the townspeople he had observed more closely in recent days. Mrs. Larkins, whose rivalry over roses hinted at a readiness to engage in minor subterfuge. Mr. Tilley, meticulous and anxious, whose slip of timing had initially attracted suspicion. Miss Lacey, who thrived on the town's gossip, and the vicar, whose calm exterior masked a keen appreciation for subtle scandal. Each could act with intent, yet each had left small, telling inconsistencies in word and gesture. He reflected, too, on the nature of confession itself. People did not confess lightly, and those who sought to communicate indirectly relied on nuance, intonation, timing, and the quiet pressure of expectation. Sister Agnes's reactions, the scuff marks at the marquee, the overturned chair, and the subtle smudges on the paper all carried messages. They were not loud, they did not demand attention. Instead, they whispered. The inspector sipped his tea, allowing these observations to settle into a coherent map of human behavior. He noted how easily Flaxborough's outward civility could mask resentment, rivalry, or a desire for influence. Small acts, placing a note, moving a chair, whispering a word, became instruments of subtle persuasion, shaping perception without overt confrontation. He considered the anonymous delivery of the confession form. Its very subtlety, the deliberate absence of a signature or explanation, suggested a mind intent on control rather than exposure. Whoever had orchestrated the events understood the town's social dynamics intimately, using its routines, civility, and collective tendencies as a medium for influence. Purbright leaned back and allowed a faint smile. The truth, as he knew, was rarely abrupt or loud. It emerged through patience, observation, and an understanding of human nature in its ordinary, polite, and occasionally mischievous forms. When the time came, a single, well-placed question, a gentle suggestion, or a minor test could unravel the careful web, revealing the orchestrator not through force, but through their own missteps, small and inevitable. He set aside the tea, folded the notes, and prepared for the next stage. Observation alone would no longer suffice. A subtle probe, an understated test, would soon be necessary. In Flaxborough, civility could be a shield, but it could not withstand quiet scrutiny conducted with patience, attention, and the gentlest precision. Purbright, as always, intended to see the matter through to its conclusion with neither haste nor melodrama, letting the human motives reveal themselves in the manner he alone could discern. The following morning, Purbright arranged a seemingly innocuous meeting at the town hall, inviting Sister Agnes, Mr. Tilly, Mrs. Larkins, and Miss Lacey under the pretense of discussing the flower show arrangements for next year. The room was modest, suffused with sunlight and the faint scent of old polished wood, and all participants took their seats with the practiced civility that Flaxborough demanded. Purbright began with casual remarks about horticultural techniques and ribbon adjudication, his tone light and unassuming. Gradually, he introduced small, pointed questions about the movements of certain individuals during the show, the location of a misplaced chair, and the minor scuff marks near the begonia display. He asked nothing overt, phrased everything as an observation or suggestion, and allowed the natural pauses, the involuntary glances, and the measured gestures to reveal more than words could express. Mrs. Larkins stiffened first. Her hand, previously resting calmly in her lap, twitched subtly as he mentioned the scuff marks. Mr. Tilly fidgeted with a ribbon, glancing toward the doorway as though calculating an escape. Miss Lacey's lips curved into a faint smile, betraying interest more than anxiety. And Sister Agnes, though outwardly composed, seemed to feel a quiet tension ripple through the room, her eyes shifting minutely whenever any one of the other three spoke. Purbright allowed the moment to stretch, letting the subtle discomfort accumulate, until finally he spoke, his voice gentle, precise, almost conversational. One observes, of course, that small acts often reveal more than grand gestures. A note placed behind a prize, a chair moved aside, or a form left at the convent gate. These might appear trivial, yet they suggest an attentiveness to timing, to reaction, to the smallest shift in routine. The air in the room thickened, the polite veneer of Flaxborough civility struggling against a rising awareness. Mrs. Larkins' eyes darted toward Miss Lacey toward Mr. Tilly, and Mr. Tilly, unable to meet anyone's gaze, finally cleared his throat. "And yet," Purbright continued as casually as if discussing the weather, "the form left at the convent, the confession, unsigned and unexplained, seems particularly deliberate. Someone wished to communicate, yet remain unseen. A careful observer, intimately familiar with how one might react to subtle provocations." Mrs. Larkins exhaled sharply, as though trying to dissipate a sudden, unspoken accusation. Mr. Tilly's face paled imperceptibly, and Miss Lacey, ever alert to nuance, betrayed a fleeting expression of concern, quickly masked with polite composure. Purbright let the silence linger a moment longer, then smiled faintly. It is remarkable how even the smallest gestures can speak volumes when observed attentively, and how, in Flaxborough, civility can both conceal and reveal intention, depending on the observer's patience. At last, Sister Agnes, calm but decisive, inclined her head slightly toward one of the other three. The subtle acknowledgement, the briefest flicker of recognition in her eyes, confirmed what Purbright had already deduced. The careful orchestration of notes, gestures, and minor disruptions had been executed by someone who understood the town's rhythms intimately. The guilty party, realizing that their precise manipulations had not gone unnoticed, allowed the weight of quiet scrutiny to settle. They did not resist, did not protest. Purbright's test had been sufficient. A single, well-placed observation, a gentle nudge, and the patterns of human behavior had spoken for themselves. The inspector, satisfied that the web of minor intrigues, subtle provocations, and understated manipulations had been traced to its source, allowed the conversation to drift back into general remarks about the next year's flower show. Civility returned almost immediately, as if the town itself had decided the disruption was concluded, and the ordinary rhythms of Flaxborough life resumed their gentle sway. The next morning, Purbright took a quiet walk through the streets of Flaxborough, reflecting on the subtle signals and small missteps that had revealed more than any dramatic confession could. The town itself, bathed in soft sunlight, moved with its usual ordinariness, shopkeepers arranging goods, children skipping along the pavements, and neighbors exchanging polite greetings that carried just a hint of yesterday's whispered speculations. In his mind, he reviewed the events: Sister Agnes's fainting, the whispered fragment of a confession, the note behind the prize certificate, the anonymous delivery of the confession form, and the subtle behaviors of Mrs. Larkins, Mr. Tilly, and Miss Lacey. Each incident, minor in isolation, had contributed to an unmistakable pattern, a careful orchestration designed to unsettle, to manipulate, yet remain beneath the threshold of overt accusation. He considered human nature in its ordinary forms, the petty rivalries, the concealed resentments, and the eagerness to maintain appearances while exercising small, private influence. In Flaxborough, civility was both shield and instrument, and those who understood it best could manipulate the town almost invisibly. But human behavior, even when disciplined and polite, carried telltale signs. Hesitations, glances, shifts in posture, and subtle contradictions in speech could betray intention if observed patiently. Purbright returned to his office, taking up the notes he had made during the preceding days. He studied the minor discrepancies once more: the angle of the scuff marks in the marquee, the precise folding of the note, the carefully orchestrated timings of people entering and leaving. He reflected on Sister Agnes's reactions, noting how her subtle shifts had confirmed more than any verbal account could. The truth was there, delicately embedded in human interactions, waiting to be assembled like a puzzle. He allowed himself a faint smile. The town's polite facades and understated routines had not prevented discovery. They had, in fact, provided the very framework within which observation could reveal design. He would, in due course, bring the pieces together, demonstrating how every small act, every minor gesture, and every carefully timed note contributed to the orchestration of unease. Yet there was no rush. Flaxborough's pace was gentle, its residents polite, and the truth, as always, would emerge not with drama, but with quiet certainty. Patience, discretion, and the careful interpretation of human behavior would suffice. Purbright, seated in his familiar chair, prepared himself to guide the final steps of revelation with the same calm deliberation that had defined the entire inquiry. By evening, he had formulated the sequence of encounters, the questions to ask, and the subtle prompts that would allow the guilty party to reveal themselves without confrontation. In Flaxborough, civility was never wholly discarded, even under suspicion, and it would be precisely this civility that would carry the truth to the surface. Purbright chose a quiet afternoon to arrange a meeting with the key figures once more, this time in the convent's sunlit parlour, ostensibly to discuss next year's flower show. The room was calm, furnished modestly, with the faint aroma of wax polish and old books, and it lent itself well to observation without seeming confrontational. Sister Agnes, Mrs. Larkins, Mr. Tilly, and Miss Lacey were present, each seated with polite attention, exchanging the usual social pleasantries, all under the inspector's watchful eye. He spoke of mundane topics at first, the timing of prize distributions, the placement of the marquee, the challenges of coordinating volunteers. Then, with careful casualness, he introduced subtler points, the precise location of the scuffed chair, the folds in the anonymous confession form, and the trajectory of people moving near the begonia display. Each observation was phrased as if incidental, a remark about routine, yet each one carried implicit scrutiny. Mrs. Larkins shifted, adjusting her gloves with a flicker of tension in her eyes. Mr. Tilly's fingers drummed lightly on the table, his gaze intermittently dropping to the floor. Miss Lacey, though outwardly composed, allowed a faint, fleeting tightening of her lips. Sister Agnes, calm but perceptive, observed each reaction quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Purbright let the room settle into a pregnant pause, allowing the subtle discomfort to accumulate. The silence, punctuated only by minor movements and polite coughs, worked to reveal more than direct questioning could. Finally, with the lightest inflection of curiosity in his voice, he said, "It is remarkable how, in Flaxborough, even the smallest gestures can carry intention. A note left in a careful place, a chair nudged aside, a minor scuff on a polished floor. They might appear trivial, yet they speak volumes to those attuned to observe." All eyes shifted in slight, involuntary acknowledgement. Mrs. Larkins exhaled, a faint redness creeping into her cheeks. Mr. Tilly's hands froze mid-drumming. Miss Lacey's smile, quick and slight, did not entirely mask the apprehension in her eyes. Purbright's gaze rested on Sister Agnes, who inclined her head just enough to indicate recognition. The faintest exchange of glances between her and the guilty party confirmed the inspector's deductions. The orchestration of minor incidents, the fainting, the whispered confession, the note behind the prize certificate, and the anonymous delivery of the confession form was the work of someone intimately familiar with both human behavior and the town's rhythms. The guilty party, now, confronted not with accusation but with subtle, undeniable evidence, allowed the truth to settle without protest. The careful manipulations, once concealed beneath civility and ordinary routine, were laid bare by observation, patience, and the quiet skill of a man who understood the language of small gestures. Purbright concluded with a gentle observation, almost as if discussing horticulture rather than human intrigue. In Flaxborough, civility is not merely a courtesy, it is the medium in which secrets are kept and revealed alike. One only needs the patience to observe, and the human motives unfold as naturally as the blooms in a garden. The tension eased, smiles returned, polite conversation resumed, and the town's rhythms began to settle once more. Civility, that ever-reliable shield, had carried the revelation as effectively as confrontation could, and Purbright noted with quiet satisfaction that the town's equilibrium was restored. In the gentle hush of the convent parlour, Purbright finally laid out the sequence of events, speaking with his customary calm precision. The gathering listened attentively, each detail articulated as if part of an ordinary report rather than a revelation. "Let us consider first the fainting of Sister Agnes," he began, nodding subtly to her. "It was not an accident, nor merely the result of nervousness. The timing, the placement of certain individuals nearby, and the reactions of those present indicate careful orchestration." He glanced briefly at Mrs. Larkins, whose fingers twitched against her gloves, and Miss Lacey, whose polite composure had just begun to falter. The note behind the prize certificate, the anonymous confession form left at the convent, and even the minor disturbances in the marquee, all these acts were small, deliberate, and designed to unsettle without drawing overt attention. The room remained polite, still, yet the faint undercurrent of anticipation grew. Purbright allowed a moment, letting the evidence of human behavior, the hesitations, the glances, the slight reddening of cheeks, speak louder than words. "Now," he said, inclining his head ever so slightly, "it becomes clear that the individual orchestrating these minor yet precise events understood both the rhythm of Flaxborough and the temperaments of its residents. One observes carefully, one notes inconsistencies, and the pattern emerges. In this instance, the orchestration fell to one well acquainted with subtle influence and the human propensity for reaction. He allowed the silence to stretch, giving the assembled group time to process. Sister Agnes's eyes flickered ever so slightly toward one corner of the room, and in that moment, the guilty party, the orchestrator of the minor intrigues, recognized the certainty in Purbright's calm demeanor. "You see," Purbright continued, in a tone that was more conversational than accusatory, "the fainting, the note, the scuff marks, and the altered chair were not random. Each was an exercise in control, subtlety, and observation. The intention was never to harm, but to manipulate the perceptions and reactions of others." Mrs. Larkins's shoulders slumped ever so slightly. Miss Lacey's lips pressed together in acknowledgement. Mr. Tilly, though relieved of suspicion, exhaled softly. Sister Agnes inclined her head, her calm expression lending dignity to the proceedings, confirming in the smallest gesture that the truth had been revealed without fanfare or dramatics. Purbright folded his hands across the table and concluded, "In Flaxborough, civility is the lens through which human motives are expressed. One need only observe, patiently and attentively, and the truth presents itself quietly, without theatrics, through the ordinary actions and gestures of people, each acting in accordance with their character." With that, the meeting eased into polite conversation about next year's flower show. The minor tensions melted into the town's usual rhythms. The guilty party accepted the consequences with the quietest acknowledgement. The town resumed its ordinary social patterns, and the subtle equilibrium, so vital to Flaxborough life, was restored. Purbright returned to his office, content to sift through routine paperwork, the gentle satisfaction of a case resolved pervading his quiet study. Outside, the streets glimmered under the late afternoon sun, and life moved forward, calm, measured, and undisturbed by the minor intrigues that had temporarily stirred the town's pulse.